The United States is one of only a few countries in the world whose nationality laws are based on where you were reborn, not on your parents' citizenship. But why is birthright citizenship established in the United States? Let's explore that in this video. Hey there, welcome back to my channel. I'm here to explain America and help you make sense of current events. In this video, we're going to answer the question, why did the United States adopt birthright citizenship? And if you stick around to the end, I'll share with you what it would take to change the U.S. nationality laws and whether that's ever likely to happen. To understand why birthright citizenship was created, we have to first travel back in time to the mid-1800s when America was dealing with its greatest crisis: slavery and the war over it. At that time, the rules about who was considered a citizen were very different than they are now. And those differences were about to have an enormous impact on how our country defines citizenship today. Now, during the antebellum period, meaning the time before the Civil War, the question of whether enslaved people were citizens wasn't really up for debate. Enslaved people themselves weren't debating it because their voices were largely absent from political discussions and white Americans of the time didn't really debate it either. For them, the issue of slavery was a moral one, but also an economic and political one. But that changed in 1857 when the Supreme Court weighed in on the issue in a landmark case called Dred Scott v. Sandford. In the Dred Scott case, the court decided that no matter if a slave was free, he could never become a citizen of the United States, and that black people were not and could not become part of the political community. In other words, black folks were regarded as an inferior race, unassimilable into American national identity, and thus excluded from the privileges and immunities of citizenship. Well, this decision outraged many white Americans, especially in the northern states, who argued that if African Americans were not citizens, then all of the protections of the Constitution didn't apply to them, including the right to life, liberty, and property. Many abolitionists saw the Dred Scott ruling as a clear example of how the Supreme Court was giving too much power to slave states at the expense of free states. Ironically, this was the last Supreme Court decision before the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, and once the war began, the abolitionists got their revenge. See, after the Union victory in the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution to guarantee equal protection under the law and due process of law to all persons born in the United States. Now, these amendments were passed to address specifically the status of former enslaved people. At the time, the definition of citizenship did not include black people. So by adding the 14th Amendment, Congress intended to remedy that. Section 1 of the amendment begins with the famous words, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside." Before this amendment, being born in the United States did not necessarily make you a citizen, especially if you were a person of color. But now birth in the United States became the primary criterion for acquiring citizenship. As historian Kenneth Dunn put it, the most important single change which the 14th Amendment accomplished was that it substituted birth for ancestry as the test of nationality. So let's quickly recap why birthright citizenship was created. First, it was created to overturn the Dred Scott decision, which had denied citizenship to black people. Second, it was created to guarantee citizenship to former slaves. Third, it was created to establish a clear and equal standard. Up until that point, citizenship was determined arbitrarily. With birthright citizenship, anyone born in the United States was a citizen, regardless of race or background. And fourth, it was created to prevent states from denying rights to freedmen. Southern states had been trying to block rights for freedmen and women. But the 14th Amendment gave the federal government the power to ensure that those born in the U.S. had equal protection under the law, no matter where they lived. Now, while birthright citizenship was meant to be a universal rule, the reality is that the United States has never been very good at following its own rules. For example, in 1923, The Bureau of Immigration issued a ruling saying that children born in the U.S. to non-migrant foreign visitors were not U.S. citizens. That contradicts the text of the 14th Amendment, but it stood as precedent for nearly 50 years. And even after it was overturned in 1972, immigration officials still sometimes denied U.S. citizenship to people who were born in the U.S. because of their parents' immigration status. But generally speaking, birthright citizenship has endured, and it has served us well. It has guaranteed full rights and protections to all people born in the United States, no matter where they or their ancestors came from. And it has given immigrants the freedom to come to the United States knowing that their children will be able to enjoy the same rights and freedoms that they themselves do. Now, despite the benefits of birthright citizenship, some argue that we should change the U.S. nationality laws to a system of birthright plus, meaning that to be a U.S. citizen, you must either be born in the United States or have a parent who is a U.S. citizen. Proponents of this idea argue that it would prevent undocumented immigration and help reduce the number of people claiming U.S. citizenship who actually have little or no connection to the United States. Well, whether that's true or not, changing the U.S. nationality laws would be no small feat. It would require a constitutional amendment, since Article 2 of the Constitution says that anyone born a subject of a foreign state within the U.S. is a U.S. citizen. To change that, we would need a constitutional amendment or an act of Congress. But since Congress has no power to amend the Constitution, that means we'd need a constitutional amendment. Now, constitutional amendments are hard to pass. They require a 2/3 vote by Congress and then approval by 3/4 of all state legislatures. So getting an amendment like this passed would be very difficult. Plus, it's not clear it would even work, since birthright citizenship is also enshrined in the 14th Amendment. Now I know that can be confusing, so let me just spell it out. Right now, there are two possible ways to become a U.S. citizen. First, you can be born in the United States, and that makes you a citizen. Or second, you can be born outside the United States and have a parent who is a U.S. citizen, and that makes you a U.S. citizen. If we changed the U.S. nationality laws to a system of birthright plus, then only the second option would remain. You could still be born in the United States and become a citizen through your parents. But unless one of your parents is a U.S. citizen, you wouldn't automatically become a U.S. citizen just by being born in the United States. There are plenty of people who feel so passionately about this that they say we ought to do it. But realistically, it's just not going to happen anytime soon. There are lots of things that are more likely to happen first, like finding conclusive evidence of extraterrestrial life or a cure for cancer. Not gonna hold my breath. So the United States has had a long and complicated history when it comes to race relations. From the arrival of the first Africans in the United States in 1619 through the present day. We've come a long way, but we've also had our backslides. Birthright citizenship was one of the ways that this country grappled with its history of slavery and its legacy. And it's something we should all be grateful for. Okay, I hope that cleared up any confusion about what birthright citizenship is and why the United States adopted it. In this video, we're going to talk about one of the most basic concepts in American history, namely, what it means to be an American by birth. As many of you know, the United States is one of only a few countries that offers birthright citizenship, meaning that anyone born on American soil is automatically a U.S. citizen, regardless of their parents' nationality. But this hasn't always been the case. And before we had the 14th Amendment guaranteeing birthright citizenship to all persons born in the United States, the question of whether someone was an American citizen or not was much more complicated. So in this video, we're going to trace the evolution of American ideas about citizenship from the colonial period all the way up to the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos on this channel, you'll know that I'm a big fan of thematic units. And this video is no exception. The story of American citizenship is intricately tied to the broader story of American immigration. So if you want to dive deeper into the stories of the people who came to America and the challenges they faced, you should check out the Crash Course Kid series, A New Home. available exclusively on a subscription streaming service for kids. The series follows several immigrant families as they journey to America and start new lives in the 19th century. Through these personal stories, kids will learn about larger historical forces at play, like industrialization and urbanization, plus gain insight into the lives of those who came before them. The series also includes fun extras like activity books and discussion guides to help kids get even more out of the series. And as always, with Crash Course, there are amazing educational resources built into every episode to help kids and parents navigate this fascinating time period. There's quizzes, timelines, and more. Plus, the series is produced by the folks who make the popular educational YouTube channel Crash Course. Okay, let's get back to the video. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. How did Americans come to adopt this idea that anyone born in the country was a citizen? Well, in order to answer that question, we have to look north to Great Britain. You see, the idea of birthright citizenship was a part of British common law. Remember, common law is just a fancy way of saying laws that were developed through custom and tradition over time. See, under British common law, the concept of jus soli, or right of the soil, was the norm. Basically, anyone born within the king's realm was automatically a British subject, even if their parents were foreigners. And this applied in the American colonies too. So if you were born in Virginia in 1740, for example, you were a British subject. Even if your parents were German immigrants who had come to Virginia a few years earlier, if they had come legally and settled in the colony, that is. Of course, things were much more complicated for those who arrived in the colonies without the right to be here, like indentured servants and enslaved people. But that's a story for another time. But when the American Revolutionary War broke out in 1776, it was unclear whether the Americans would win or lose. And if they did win, it was even unclear whether they would form a new country or simply become a new province within the British Empire. Nevertheless, in the Declaration of Independence, the American leaders asserted that all people are endowed with certain unalienable rights, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They also listed grievances against the King of England, asserting that he had denied them the right to self-government. So even though the future of American independence was far from secure, the authors of the Declaration clearly believed that they were creating a new kind of country. And after winning the war and establishing a new government, Americans began to think seriously about what kind of nation they wanted to build. During this period, there was a lot of debate about how to handle slavery and who exactly was allowed to be a citizen of the new country. These debates were complicated because during the colonial period, not everyone living in the colonies was considered a citizen. Only adult males who met certain property requirements and could vote were considered citizens. Women, African Americans, Native Americans, and most immigrants were not considered citizens and were largely excluded from political participation. Many Americans assumed that citizenship would be extended only to white male landowners who had property in a new nation. That way, it would mirror the English system that they had known for so long. But others thought that the United States should establish a new kind of nation, one that extended citizenship to all free men regardless of race or property ownership. As state governments began to set up their own laws, some included provisions for free non-white men to become citizens. For example, in 1784, the state of New York passed a law granting freedom and citizenship to black people born in the state, regardless of their parents' status. But the issue of citizenship remained a topic of debate and anxiety as the United States grew. In 1790, the first national census counted about 4 million people in the United States, and nearly 4/5 of them were enslaved. As the population continued to grow, the number of immigrants also increased dramatically. Between 1820 and 1860, the foreign-born population jumped from about 700,000 to over 4.5 million people. While most immigrants came from Britain, Ireland, and Germany, people also immigrated from China, India, and many other parts of the world. And while not all immigrants came to the United States seeking a new life, Many hoped to escape difficult economic circumstances or political persecution in their home countries. Whatever the reasons for their migration, large numbers of immigrants created both opportunities and challenges for the United States. On the one hand, they contributed to the booming economy and growing cities. On the other hand, some native-born Americans saw immigrants as a threat. They feared that immigrants were taking jobs away from native-born citizens, and that they would eventually take over the country. This fear led to anti-migrant riots, especially against Irish immigrants, who were seen as a threat to American jobs and wages. Meanwhile, the growth of slavery in the southern states intensified the debate over who should be allowed to become a citizen. Southerners argued that since most enslaved people had been born in the United States, they should be considered citizens and given the right to vote. But this proposal was rejected by non-slaveholding states. In 1808, Congress passed a law prohibiting the importation of enslaved people from Africa. But millions of Africans were still enslaved in the United States. And as the decades passed, more and more Americans began to question the morality of slavery itself. But finding a compromise between slave and free states over the issue of citizenship proved difficult. In 1838, the Supreme Court weighed in on the issue in a landmark case called Dred Scott v. Sandford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to live in free territory. When his owner died, Scott sued for his freedom on the basis that he had lived in free territory and therefore could not be a slave. Unfortunately for Mr. Scott, the Supreme Court ruled that enslaved people could never become free and that no black person, free or enslaved, could ever become a citizen of the United States. Chief Justice Roger Taney argued in his written opinion that black people were inherently inferior and not equal to white people. Therefore, they could never truly be American citizens. This decision only heightened tensions between slave and free states, and the question of citizenship became increasingly linked to the question of slavery. To try and find a compromise, the Republican Party tried to address the issue of citizenship in its platform. In 1860, the party nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate for president. Although he wasn't the first to propose such a plan, Lincoln famously supported extending citizenship to all persons born in the United States, except for Native Americans. But as we now know, Lincoln's election led to the secession crisis and the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, at first blush, it might seem odd that the question of who could be a citizen would cause such strife in the young country. But remember that citizenship isn't just a legal or bureaucratic designation. It's a way of belonging to a particular group of people. When Americans debated the question of citizenship in the early republic, they were really asking a much bigger question about who belonged in the new nation. For many Americans, citizenship was not just a legal status, it was a badge of identity, a way of defining themselves as a distinct and exceptional people. I hope that helped you understand how the question of citizenship became so contentious in the early years of the United States. If you want to learn more about this topic, I've included links to some helpful resources in the description of this video. I've also included a link to a streaming service, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, has an exclusive kids series all about immigration called A New Home. And in this video, we are going to consider another one of your required Supreme Court cases for AP government, namely Dred Scott v. Sandford in 1857. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, first of all, as always, let's get the facts of the case. So this case was decided in 1857, but the story begins well before that. Our story begins with a guy named Dred Scott, who was born into slavery in Missouri in 1800, and he was the property of a military officer named John Emerson. Now, the thing about slavery at this point in American history is that while it was legal in Missouri, it was not legal in Illinois or Wisconsin. So when Emerson took Scott to live with him in those states, Scott gained hope that he might someday earn his freedom. And his reasoning was that if slavery was not legal in these places, then surely he could not remain a slave, right? Well, yeah, actually, that would be correct. But alas, it was not the time for logic and reason to prevail over the evils of slavery. It was the time for judicial review. So after living in free states for several years, Scott eventually returned to Missouri. And during that time, he married a woman named Harriet, and they had 2 children. After living in Illinois and Wisconsin, they were no longer Scott and property. They were Scott and family. And as such, Scott thought he should be able to sue for his freedom in federal court. In case you're not an omniscient Supreme Court justice, let me just explain why Scott thought he could do this. Basically, since he was a husband and a father and a Missouri resident, he was a member of the community, which means he had standing to bring lawsuits. Right? Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But the Supreme Court disagreed. In fact, the entire court was like, "You are not a person." I mean, I know that's hard to believe because you're rewatching this video right now, where I'm talking about it, and you can see that I'm talking to someone right now, which implies that I am talking to a human being. But according to the Supreme Court, Dred Scott was not a human being. Let me explain what happened. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was heard by a jury under the direction of Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. And let me tell you, Roger B. Taney hated Dred Scott's guts. In fact, in writing the majority opinion for the court, he said this, quote, "The very fact that he was black and a member of an African tribe, that he belonged to a race which was forbidden to become citizens of the United States," end quote. Do you hear that? He's saying that being black was enough to negate Scott's citizenship. And that's crazy, right? I mean, that is literally the definition of racism. But wait, it gets even crazier. Taney continued, saying that no matter how many years Scott lived in free states, he could not change his racial essence, and therefore, he could never be a citizen. And remember what I said in the introduction? Dred Scott was a husband, and a father, and a Missouri resident, things that generally qualify you to be considered a person in American society. But Taney argued that none of these things qualified Dred Scott because he was black, and therefore he could not sue in federal court. And on top of all that, Taney said that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in U.S. territories. This was a direct strikedown of the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery north of the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel. So basically, if you want to boil this case down to its essence, here you go. The decision was that, because Dred Scott was black, he could not be a citizen. Therefore, he had no standing to sue. And also, Congress had no power to regulate slavery in the territories. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might be saying, wait, what about the 14th Amendment? And fair enough, but the 14th Amendment wouldn't be ratified for another 8 years after this decision. But regardless, let's talk about why this case matters. First of all, in addition to being an egregious example of racism, this decision denied legal existence to an entire group of people, namely, all black people. If you were black, then you could not be a citizen. Therefore, you had no rights. And that was awful. Like, let's just be clear here. What Taney and his fellow justices said in this decision was horrible. However, we should also consider why this case matters from the perspective of the time period in which it was decided. After all, this decision came at a time when the nation was sharply divided over the issue of slavery. And in response to that, the Missouri Compromise had attempted to limit the spread of slavery in new territories. And that was seen as a threat to the southern states who wanted to keep slavery legal everywhere. And with this decision, the Supreme Court sided with the South, arguing that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. And therefore, technically speaking, slavery could exist anywhere in the United States. That meant that the Missouri Compromise, which had been the law of the land since 1820, was now null and void. And so here we have this situation in which the Supreme Court has just given a huge victory to the pro-slavery side. And you would think that that would make Southerners happy, but it didn't. You want to know why? Well, here's why. Ever since the nation was founded, Southerners had been arguing that slavery was a necessary evil that the nation could not do without. And when you say something is a necessary evil, you're implying that you wish it didn't exist, but you kind of need it to exist. For example, in the founding era, some of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery, but they kept it in the Constitution because they feared that without slavery, the Southern states would not join the Union. So they said, you know what? We don't like slavery, but we kinda need it. And that was the basis of their argument for slavery. But in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court said, actually, Congress has no power to abolish slavery anywhere. So if slavery was a necessary evil, then why did the Supreme Court take away the one thing that made it a necessary evil, namely Congress's ability to abolish slavery where it deemed fit? In other words, by striking down the Missouri Compromise, the court took away the last shred of political legitimacy that slavery had. And that's why Southerners hated the Dred Scott decision. Now obviously, this decision outraged Northerners as well, because it meant that the court was sanctioning slavery in new territories, which meant more representation for slave states in the House and the Senate. But for our purposes, the most important thing to understand about this decision is that it pushed the nation further toward civil war. Here's the thing. Ever since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the nation had been operating under a set of unwritten rules designed to keep the number of slave states equal to the number of free states. But the Dred Scott decision destroyed that balance. And with it, any hope of compromise between North and South was destroyed as well. And because of that, the likelihood of civil war increased dramatically. Okay, I hope that helped. So glad you're here today as we begin our journey into the post-Civil War era, often called Reconstruction. We've been following the big question of this course, which is, how did the United States go from a colonial power in 1776 to an industrial superpower by 1900? Last time we talked about how the antebellum period, meaning before the war, the decades before the Civil War, how those decades saw massive growth and expansion across the United States. And one of the questions we ended on last time was, can this nation, which has just grown so dramatically, can it survive the strain of adding all these new states to the Union? And that question exploded into violence as the nation broke apart into civil war from 1861 to 1865. And during the war, particularly after 1863, the goal of ending slavery became the central goal of the Union war effort. Now, when we talk about the Civil War, we're going to do it in another unit. This unit focuses specifically on the end of slavery in the United States. And there's a lot to consider, because although the United States fought a war to end slavery, it didn't end right away. It took some time, so let's get started. First things first, let's go back to the start. As I mentioned, the Civil War began in 1861 and lasted until 1865. And while it was called the Civil War, there was no denying that the major cause of the war was the disagreement over slavery. Although there were many other contributing factors, slavery was definitely the big one. But the question whether the war would be about ending slavery was very much up in the air, at least in the beginning. You see, when the secession crisis hit in 1860 and the Southern states were leaving the Union and forming the Confederacy, they didn't want to hear anything about ending slavery. They were protecting slavery, but they weren't talking about expanding it. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April of 1861, slavery was not the issue that was being fought about. For the first 2 years of the war, it seemed like the main issue was keeping the Union together. But as the war dragged on and on, the anti-slavery element of the war grew and grew until it was the central issue. And we'll talk more about that in our next video. But the point is that in the beginning, President Abraham Lincoln was not interested in fighting a war over slavery. He didn't want to abolish slavery. He didn't even really want to end it where it existed. He just wanted to keep it out of the new territories. But as the war dragged on, the goal of ending slavery absorbed the political imagination of both the North and the South. By the end of the war, both sides were fighting to end slavery once and for all. And that brings us to our first turning point in this story, which is the Emancipation Proclamation. In January of 1863, amid growing abolitionist sentiment, Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all enslaved people in states that were still in rebellion against the Union would be set free. Now, this was a masterful stroke of political strategy. For one thing, it got rid of the moral ambiguity of the war. There was no denying at that point that the war was about ending slavery. Also, it gave the Union war effort a major boost in manpower, because now African Americans could join the Union Army. And finally, and maybe most importantly, it put the moral weight of the nation behind the war effort. No longer was this just a political fight to preserve the Union. Now it was a crusade for human freedom. And that galvanized the northern population around the war effort. But as we can see right here in the map of the United States, it's only a small portion of the slaves in the United States lived in states that were still in rebellion against the Union. So while the Emancipation Proclamation did free a significant number of slaves, it did not end slavery in the United States. That would not happen until 3 years later with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. And actually, we should pause here for a moment and recognize that the 13th Amendment did not end slavery everywhere. Slavery continues to exist in various forms around the world even today. Mauritania, Sudan, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Yemen, to name a few. Okay, so now let's talk about the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1865, and it did what the Emancipation Proclamation could not quite do on its own. It legally abolished slavery throughout the United States. And look at the wording of this amendment. It says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, that phrase, except as a punishment for a crime, is important. Even though slavery was abolished, people could still be forced to work without pay as a punishment for a crime. This is what we call in America a legal technicality, and it will become important later. Now, when the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, approximately 4 million people were freed from slavery in the United States. But it was not a complete victory for several reasons. First, the amendment did not address the issue of citizenship. To be clear, the 13th Amendment did not say that black people were citizens of the United States. Second, Southern states quickly passed what were called black codes, which severely restricted the rights of newly emancipated people. And these laws made it very difficult for African Americans to make meaningful lives for themselves. Here are just some of the ways that black codes restricted the rights of African Americans in the Southern states. They banned them from owning land, from testifying in court, from serving on juries, from voting, from gathering in large numbers, and even from leaving their homes without written permission from their former masters. Clearly, the passage of the 13th Amendment did not mean true freedom for African Americans. And that leads us to our second turning point in this story, which is a question. What does it mean to be free in America if you have no citizenship? To answer that question, we have to think about what citizenship means. Citizens have certain rights, including the right to vote, to hold office, to make contracts, to own property, to buy and sell land, and to testify in court. If African Americans were not citizens, then they could not enjoy the protections of the law. Southern states hoped that by denying them these rights, African Americans would remain dependent on white Southerners, either working for them as sharecroppers on plantations or as domestic servants in Southern homes. Basically, they wanted to create a permanent underclass of cheap labor. And the way they did this was through something called sharecropping. Sharecropping was a system by which former slaves worked the land of their former masters in exchange for a small portion of the crops they produced. And while this arrangement might sound like a perfectly fair deal, it actually kept former slaves in a state of perpetual debt peonage. Here's how it worked. Former slaves would borrow tools and supplies from their former masters in order to work the fields. And of course, they would repay this debt with a portion of their harvest. But almost always, sharecroppers found themselves owing more money than they could ever hope to repay. And so they remained trapped on the land they once toiled on as slaves. And this brings us to our final turning point in this story, which is the 14th Amendment. Passed in 1868, the 14th Amendment was a direct response to the Black Codes, and its purpose was to guarantee that the freedom won in the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation meant citizenship, rights, and legal protection. Let's look at the wording of the amendment. It says, quote, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." The 14th Amendment was a landmark ruling. It guaranteed that African American men could vote, hold office, own property, and enjoy all the rights and privileges of American citizenship. However, the struggle for civil rights was far from over. We'll pick that story up in the next unit. As always, if you want to review, preview, or learn more about this topic or any topic in social studies, check out the Crash Course website. I'm learning something new on this channel every day. In this video, we go into look at another one of your required Supreme Court cases for the AP government curriculum, namely the landmark case known as the 14th Amendment. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. So as always, let's begin with the facts of the case. So the 14th Amendment wasn't really a case, but rather an amendment to the Constitution that was passed in 1868. And its main purpose was to radically redefine what it meant to be a citizen of the United States. To understand why this was so important, we have to take a little detour into the history of the time. Okay, so in the case of Dred Scott, which I've already made a video about, remember that the Supreme Court ruled that since enslaved people were considered property, they could not possibly be citizens of the United States. And then, after the Civil War, many Southern states attempted to pass laws that denied basic rights to freed slaves, believing that since they were not citizens, they did not have to be treated as such. So these laws were basically saying things like, yeah, you're free from your chains, but you can't own property, you can't testify in court, you can't vote, and you sure as hell can't intermarry with white folks. And this created a situation where newly freed slaves were still living in a state of second-class citizenship. So in order for Congress to protect the rights of these former slaves, they needed something that would guarantee those rights and protections throughout the entire nation. They could do that with a law, but laws can be overturned. They could also do that with a treaty, but treaties can also be overturned. And besides, this problem was not just limited to one state or another. It was a nationwide problem. Therefore, the only thing that could solve this issue was a change to the Constitution. And that is exactly what the 14th Amendment did. So let's see what it says. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment reads, "All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Let's break that down a little bit. First of all, notice the phrase, "all persons born in the United States." This phrase does not specify any race or type of ancestry. Therefore, by definition, anyone who is born on U.S. soil is a citizen of the United States. But wait a minute. Doesn't that include Native Americans whose tribal nations were not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Well, yes, it does. It also includes the children of Native Americans. It also includes the children of enslaved people. And yes, it even includes the children of foreigners who may be living in the United States temporarily. In other words, no matter what race someone is, if they were born on U.S. soil, They are automatically a citizen of the United States. Now, before we go any further, let me just pause for a moment and say that when I mention race, I am aware that some of you might believe that race is a social construct and not a biological reality. If that's the case, then feel free to substitute the word racial for of color and the argument would still hold true. Okay, so now let's keep going. The next part of the amendment says that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now that phrase, equal protection of the laws, guarantees that the government cannot make any laws which deny a citizen their rights simply because of an immutable characteristic like race. For example, a state cannot pass a law that says we will not admit you to restaurants unless you are white. That would clearly violate the 14th Amendment. And finally, the last part of the amendment says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In other words, if the government wants to take away your life, your liberty, or your property, they must do so fairly and legally. So that's what the 14th Amendment says. But how did it actually affect the balance of power between the federal and state governments? Well, in this case, the answer is pretty simple. The amendment shifted an enormous amount of power from the states to the federal government. Prior to the passage of the 14th Amendment, states had the power to define who was and was not a citizen, and therefore, they could grant or withhold certain rights at will. But now the federal government had assumed that power in states were forbidden from denying any person the equal protection of the laws. In fact, the effect of the 14th Amendment was so profound that it overturned the Dred Scott decision completely, and it laid the foundation for future legislation guaranteeing civil rights protections, desegregation, modern immigration rights, and even the right of women to vote. In other words, if you're looking for the single most consequential amendment to the Constitution, well, here it is. Okay, so why does any of this matter? Why should you care about this amendment or any amendment? Well, amendments to the Constitution don't just magically appear, right? There is always a reason behind them, and that reason usually has something to do with the balance of power between the federal and state governments. So in this case, the reason this amendment was passed was to address the issue of racial discrimination and to guarantee equal rights to all persons born in the United States. And since then, the struggle over who gets to define the balance of power on this issue has been a contentious one. For example, after the passage of the 14th Amendment, debates arose over whether birthright citizenship should be extended to Native Americans and the children of immigrants. In the early 20th century, there was even talk of a constitutional amendment that would revoke birthright citizenship from non-white immigrants. Fortunately, that proposal never went anywhere. But more recently, there has been a renewed push to restrict birthright citizenship from being automatic and instead making it something that is earned through some kind of action or requirement. And this brings us to the question of whether or not you should care about this. Well, I think that this amendment matters because it demonstrates how the balance of power between the federal and state governments is constantly evolving. Remember, the 14th Amendment was passed in response to the Dred Scott decision, which itself was a response to the growing sectional crisis over slavery. And yet here we are talking about it again in the 21st century. This means that the relationship between the two levels of government is not static. It's dynamic. It changes over time. And that means that as citizens, we have to remain engaged in the political process if we want to make sure that our voices are heard and our interests are protected. Here's something that makes the United States unique in the world. When you're born in this country, you're automatically a citizen. You don't need parents who are citizens. You don't need to fill out any paperwork. You just need to be born here. Now, if you live in most countries, this may sound kind of crazy. See, over the past few decades, lots of countries around the world have ended or restricted birthright citizenship. For example, France, Ireland, Australia, and the UK. They all now require that at least one of your parents is a citizen in order for you to be a citizen yourself. And last year, India revoked citizenship from hundreds of thousands of people who'd been living there their whole lives but didn't have the right documents proving that they were citizens. But in America, you can trace our unique approach to citizenship all the way back to the 1790s. And it's endured because of what it means for our national identity, our history, and our commitment to equal rights for everyone. In fact, the U.S. is one of only about a dozen developed nations that still offers what's called automatic birthright citizenship, also known as jus soli, which literally translates to law of the soil. So let us unpack why this policy matters so much and how it became such a defining feature of the American identity. So first off, let's acknowledge that this is a really complicated topic with a lot of history behind it. We're going to focus on how the U.S. came to adopt and maintain its current system. But we're not going to get into whether this policy is fair or what other countries do or do undo, or whether other countries should adopt similar policies. This is just about the U.S. and why it keeps its automatic birthright citizenship. And we'll put some resources in the description if you want to learn more about different countries' policies. All right, let's dig in. The U.S. has long been a destination for people fleeing persecution or seeking better lives for themselves and their kids. Starting in the 1620s, when the first English settlements were established along the Atlantic coast, people have come to these shores from Europe, Africa, and Asia, and over time, the United States has grown into a true melting pot of cultures. Today, the Census Bureau reports that nearly 60 million Americans, or about 18% of the population, were born outside of the country, and that immigrants have played a critical role in almost every aspect of American life. But the reality is that throughout much of the world, being born on American soil doesn't necessarily mean you're automatically an American citizen. That's because most countries use a different system called jus sanguinis, or the law of blood, which determines citizenship based on your parents' nationality. And the trend among developed nations has been moving away from birthright citizenship. Since the 1990s, 40 countries have tightened restrictions on citizenship, including some that used to offer birthright citizenship to anyone born within their borders, like Ireland, France, and Germany. So why does the U.S. continue to buck this global trend? Well, part of the reason is historical. Let's go back to the early days of the United States. Before the American Revolution, colonial officials generally followed British rules that gave children born in America the same citizenship as their parents. But during the Revolution, things got a little messy. See, the 1776 Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights. But at the same time, the institution of slavery was still deeply ingrained in the southern colonies. The original draft of the Declaration actually included a condemnation of the slave trade. But delegates from slaveholding states successfully pushed to remove that language. So from the very beginning, there was tension between the ideals of equality espoused by the Founding Fathers and the harsh realities of American society. After the Revolution, delegates at the Constitutional Convention struggled with how to define a citizen. Should it be based on birthplace or parentage? Ultimately, they decided to go with birthplace, granting citizenship to anyone born in the United States, and at the time, this wasn't particularly radical. Other nations like France and Sweden already offered birthright citizenship. But in America, it took on new meaning thanks to the ongoing debate over slavery. Fast forward to 1857, when the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred case that enslaved people, whether free or enslaved, could never become citizens. Chief Justice Roger Taney argued that African Americans were inherently unequal and not part of the political community of the nation. So given this racist backdrop, it's no surprise that birthright citizenship became a flashpoint in the fight to abolish slavery. And after the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, and it includes the following. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are declared to be citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. The 14th Amendment was a clear rebuke of the Dred Scott decision and a major step toward guaranteeing equal rights for all Americans. And while the amendment doesn't explicitly guarantee voting rights, it does establish that all people born in the U.S. are entitled to equal protection under the law. So it lays the foundation for future legislation like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Today, birthright citizenship remains a cornerstone of American identity. In fact, even the Pledge of Allegiance affirms it. As we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, we promise to be a nation that welcomes those who come here legally and offers them a chance at a better life. It's a tradition that reflects our nation's values and ideals and ensures that all of us, regardless of where we were born or who our parents are treated equally under the law. Of course, that hasn't always been the case. For most of American history, women, people of color, and other marginalized groups have faced significant barriers to exercising their rights and participating fully in American life. And even today, disparities persist. According to the Sentencing Project, Black Americans are incarcerated in state and federal prisons at 5 times the rate of white Americans, and Indigenous Americans are incarcerated at 3 times the rate of white Americans. But birthright citizenship remains an important symbol of the promise of America, a nation where all of us have the opportunity to succeed regardless of our background. When we talk about the promise of America, we're talking about more than just economic opportunity or political representation. We're talking about the fundamental right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of our race or ethnicity, sex or sexual orientation, religion or beliefs. We're talking about the freedom to pursue our dreams without fear of persecution or discrimination. Birthright citizenship is a key part of that promise, ensuring that from the moment we're born, we're seen as valuable members of the American family. Ultimately, the United States has maintained its commitment to birthright citizenship because it's a policy that reflects our history, our values, and our commitment to equal protection for all. And it's a policy that's helped make America the diverse and vibrant nation it is today. In this series, we've explored a few of the ways that American democracy is different from other democracies around the world. We looked at how the U.S. uses a winner-take-all electoral system, how presidents are elected, and how the country's two-party system has changed over time. And today, we explored how the U.S. stands out in granting automatic birthright citizenship to nearly everyone born within its borders. We're making these videos because it's important to understand the nuances of American democracy, especially in a polarized environment. It's easy to forget that other countries have different systems of government and different ways of approaching civic life. And learning about how other democracies work can help us appreciate the complexity of American institutions and processes. Plus, it's just fascinating to see how different countries tackle similar challenges in different ways. So we hope you've enjoyed this series and learned something new. And if you want to keep exploring the world of global politics, check out the additional resources we've linked below. Thanks for watching.